Okay, we're back here looking now to continue with our discussion on plants. So we left off last time looking at the two sort of primitive plant phyla. So we looked at the bryophyta, the mosses, and the pterophyta, the ferns, right? We know now what a plant is, what characteristics, what taxonomical characteristics, the cellulose, the starch, the different types of chlorophylls. So we're going to continue onwards today, looking now at the third phylum, the Coniferophyta. So Coniferophyta will include trees, primarily trees, large plants that are going to produce cones in order to protect their seeds. So if they're plants that are producing cones, we say they're the Coniferophyta, the cone-bearing plants. So also known as evergreen trees, right? And it's going to include things like your pine trees, your junipers, redwoods, sequoias. There's a variety of species within this phylum. So all of the evergreen trees will again produce, during the reproductive time, they'll produce these cones that encase the seeds and protect the seeds from being eaten, from being damaged until they're ready to be dispersed. The reason they're called evergreen trees, they do drop needles, they do drop the leaves, but at some point, at all points throughout the year, we will find these green needles on the trees. So if you do have pine trees near your home, you know that they drop a lot of these needles, but there's green needles throughout the entire year, and that's why they're called evergreen trees. These trees do very well in colder climates, higher elevation climates, but we do find them here in El Paso. They're not necessarily native to the low desert area, but a lot of people put them in their homes, and with artificial watering, they're adaptive and they do survive long term here. So still sort of, I guess, primitive, but again, it does work. But we're going to learn later about a different strategy for pollination. But when it comes to pollination for these evergreen, these conifers, basically they rely on wind for pollination. So they're going to be wind pollinated species. They basically send out pollen into the air, not relying on insects, on butterflies, on bees to transport the pollen. They just rely on the wind, right? So the more windy it is, the more distance their pollen will be dispersed. So it's a little bit inefficient, maybe a little bit messy, maybe. It's not good for those of us that have pollen allergies. But we know that these species are still alive today. They're not extinct, so we know that this type of pollination is effective. So in the spring, you will see these yellow little male cones that are sending pollen, and any time the branches are moved by the wind, this pollen is sent out. Once the cones once we have fertilization, the seeds are ready, a lot of the cones will open up naturally. Some of the cones will rely on heat. These are what we call fire-adapted trees or plants. They rely on heat, the heat of the fire, then to melt the sap, the substances holding that cone together. Once that's melted away, the cone will open, and the seeds will be dropped on freshly sort of burned area, fertilized. We have this natural fertilization process that happens after a fire. We have a clearing of brush, more light hitting the ground. So it's a neat strategy for putting the seed in a very good, fertile type of environment there. Just to cover a little bit of the diversity of this group. So we see these very large trees. To give you a scale of reference, there's some humans down below. And again, these are large redwoods, large sequoia trees. We see these in the sort of Californian forest. Large trees, right? If you look at some of the historical accounts, some of these trees are large enough where basically there were like tunnels were carved in where they could drive vehicles through some of these large trees. So very, very large trees, very economically significant, the potential for economic significance here. You can see why there's these debates. Majestic trees, we have one sort of side of the sort of the parties here that say, no, we should leave these trees for our enjoyment, for our kids' enjoyment, right? Just this magnificent tree. There's the other side of the sort of the parties that say, well, we should cut these down. We can get a lot of trees, a lot of lumber. We can make a lot of profit off of these things, right? So again, different political views, different economic views of these natural resources here, right? Here in El Paso, we don't really deal a lot with the lumber industry. We don't really have trees, but it's a big political debate every time different people go up for election, re-election in sort of the western states there. So closer to home, not as economically significant, we have these juniper trees. We see these as maybe shrubs, as ornamental type of sort of landscaping, hedges, kind of things, or sort of little taller trees, rounder trees. They have the bracts. They have these little modified leaves, evergreen leaves, and these little fleshy kind of modified cones that protect the seeds there. So junipers. So kind of collectively more significant to some species than others, but we do know that conifers are evergreen. Since their needles, if I go back here, right, since their needles are so thin, we got to understand that is the photosynthetic tissue of the plant. So that little tiny needle is what's supposed to be capturing sunlight, converting it into glucose. Because it's so thin, it's not very effective at capturing sunlight. So photosynthesis would be relatively less, relatively slower, relatively more minimal compared to a what we call broadleaf, this very big flat leaf that will be capturing a lot of light. So since they're not as good at photosynthesis, they tend to grow slow. They tend to grow in clusters for a couple of different reasons. You would say if you're a tree, you don't want to grow next to your neighbor because that's competition for light, competition for resources in the ground. But again, it just depending on where the offspring fall, depending on how close your neighbor is, makes it a little bit easier to send pollen via this wind pollination process. So the close proximity will be causing some complications, increased competition, but it will also maybe have some benefits, easier access to potential mates since they can't actually get up and move. Maybe there's some stability that can happen when the roots overlap, maybe kind of helping them grow in some of the softer type soil, so preventing wind toppling, that kind of stuff. We know that they do have economic importance for lumber. So long, straight wood. Most of the 2x4s that make up the foundation of your house, the foundation of the walls, we know are coming from these pine trees. So again, we said that pine trees are adapted for cold climates. They do very well. There's less competition from these broadleaf trees in higher elevations in cold climates. The needles are not subjected to freeze damage, cold damage. So again, it's a kind of a place where you would find these species. And they kind of attain tall heights. If you're not that good at photosynthesis, it benefits you to grow up tall, be taller than your neighbors to get the higher intensity of light, of energy that you can convert. So conifers, we know they do very well in these sort of mixed forests as well. And in the fall, when other leaves are falling off, these pine trees stay green throughout the winter, photosynthesizing all year round. And when we talk about pine trees, I mentioned this a little bit about the fire ecology, fire adaptations. If you know a little bit about the Forest Service, Smokey the Bear was a sort of a mascot, a big proponent for sort of putting out forest fires, preventing forest fires. And we know today that different strategies have been successful, different strategies have been unsuccessful in maintaining the forest ecosystem. But we do understand that forests are adapted for fire. Forests are an ecosystem that has co-evolved, that is adapted for frequent fires. And humans kind of like that environment as well. A lot of humans like to go up to Cloudcroft. It's fresher, it's cooler. We go up to Rio Doso, maybe buy a summer cabin or something up there, right? So a lot of people have encroached onto forests and understand it's an ecosystem that is adapted for fires. If you buy a house on the beach, you know, well, there's a hurricane damage threat. If you live in a valley near a big river, you know, well, there's a flood potential. Well, if you live in a forest, you've got to understand there's basically a potential for fires, right? Because these trees drop needles, they drop branches, a lot of fuel for fires. So with that, I'll upload one video that will sort of go more into the fire ecology of plants. And I'll stop this one for now and keep an eye out for the flowering plant, for the Anthophyta, and for some more flower ecology information. Right? All right.